In 1981, France, a Japanese man brutally murdered and cannibalized a female Dutch student. He was spotted while attempting to dispose of her body in the forest and was arrested a few days later. However, the courts found him to be legally insane and he was set free, being deported back to his home country of Japan. Although Japanese authorities wanted to prosecute him, they were unable to, as French courts refused to release documents regarding the case. As a result, this man walks free to this day, even though he has publicly admitted to killing and devouring another human being. This is the story of Issei Sagawa, the Kobe Cannibal. Sagawa was born in 1949 in the city of Kobe. He was born prematurely and at the time of birth was so small he could fit on the palm of his father's hand. During his infancy, Sagawa would suffer from medical issues, and although he would eventually recover, this difficulty during and after birth would leave his body fragile and underdeveloped for life. Even as an adult, he would only grow to be 5 feet tall, weighing less than 100 pounds. On the other hand, Sagawa was born into wealth, with his father and grandfather being successful businessmen, while his mother's family were wealthy merchants. He would later claim his childhood was the best period of his life. His parents raised him lovingly, and there was nothing to worry about. However, Sagawa developed peculiar fetishes from a young age. He would recall being aroused while watching the thighs of a handsome male classmate during his first grade of school. When he was in 4th grade, he would feel desires to eat the flesh of a female classmate, again while watching her thighs peek out from under her skirt while she climbed a flight of stairs. He knew very well that there was something wrong with him, and in his high school years he would consult psychiatrists about his strange fetishes. But he was brushed off as doctors assumed he was making up his issues as some kind of sick joke. Over time, Sagawa would develop a peculiar interest in white women. He claims because he was short, weak, and ugly, he found tall foreign women to be attractive, as they possessed traits he would never have. At the age of 24, when Sagawa was a university student in Tokyo, he was mesmerized by a tall German woman. He located her apartment, and a few days later snuck in at night while she was sleeping. Sagawa's plan was to knock her out by striking her head, and using a knife to carve out a small piece of her buttocks, which he would eat later. However, due to him being a very small man, he failed to subdue the German woman, and was pinned down by her, while she called the police herself. Although he was arrested on the spot, his charges were later dropped when his father paid the woman a handsome settlement. In 1977, at the age of 27, Sagawa moved to Paris to pursue a PhD in literature. He claims that by this time he was totally obsessed with cannibalism, feeling a strong urge, something close to duty, to cannibalize a white woman. He would often call prostitutes to his room with the intent of killing and eating them, but could never get himself to go through with his desires. 4 years later, on June 11, 1981, Sagawa, now 32 years old, invited his classmate, Renee Hartevelt, a Dutch woman, to his apartment to do a school assignment together. Sagawa had a particular interest in Renee, due to her being tall, young, and beautiful. As she was reading a book with her back to Sagawa, he shot her in the back of the head, killing her instantly. He had fantasized what to do to her many times in his head, and now was his time to execute his plans. After committing necrophilia with her corpse, he would begin the process of cannibalization. Sagawa knew which part he wanted to try first, the buttocks. The right cheek in specific, because he believed the left cheek would not taste as good, due to it being closer to the heart, and therefore have more blood in it. Sagawa tried biting into her with his teeth, but found it impossible to pierce her skin. He tried using a fruit knife he had in his room, but that didn't work either. He eventually went out and bought a butcher knife, which finally allowed him to dissect Renee's body. Sagawa would continue to dismember and cannibalize various parts of her body, including her buttocks, breasts, and parts of her face. He ate some of it raw, and some of it cooked. After he had satisfied his appetite and came to his senses, he realized that the body would soon begin to rot in the summer heat and would need to dispose of it quickly. Sagawa chopped her body into pieces and stuffed them into 2 large suitcases. As he was storing what was left of Renee into the suitcases, he decides to dump her remains into a lake at a park. The suitcases were too heavy to carry a long distance by hand, so Sagawa called a taxi. As the taxi driver was loading the suitcases into the car, the driver jokingly questioned, "These bags are really heavy. What do you have inside them? A corpse?" To which Sagawa hastily answered that they were filled with books he was using for his studies. As the taxi arrived at the park, Sagawa realizes he had made a mistake. Although it was past 8 p.m., the sun was far from setting, as the sun sets somewhere around 9:30 during summertime in Paris. Sagawa had forgotten to consider this, even though he had been living in Paris for several years at this point. A tiny Asian man hauling 2 large suitcases around a park drew the attention of other people, watching curiously, wondering what this man was up to. Sagawa managed to drag the suitcases to a relatively secluded area, next to the lake where he planned to dump Renee's remains. As he was sitting on the lakeside, waiting for it to get dark so he can start disposing of the corpse, a man approached him, asking Sagawa if the suitcases belonged to him. At this point, Sagawa makes his second critical mistake. In a panic, he tells the man that the bags are not his. Hearing this, the man assumes that the suitcases have no owner, and begins opening them, presumably to see if there was anything of value inside. To the man's horror, he finds what is left of Renee, and yells out to other people nearby that there is a corpse in the bag. As the onlookers are stunned, not sure what to make of the situation, Sagawa runs from the scene. He regrets that in retrospect, had he said the bags were his, the man might have left him alone. It didn't take long for the police to track him down. 4 days from the murder, Sagawa was arrested. However, French courts ruled him legally insane, voiding him of prosecution. Why exactly the courts came to this conclusion is unclear. Some say Sagawa's expensive lawyer, paid for by his father, had influence in persuading the courts. Others say there was a mistranslation of his medical records. One of the medical issues Sagawa had during his infancy was inflammation of the intestines. When written in Japanese, looks similar to the character for the brain. Some people speculate that whoever did the translation from Japanese to French mistook these 2 characters, which led the courts to believe Sagawa had a physical issue related to his brain, making him insane. In any case, Sagawa was sent to a medical institution. But before any treatment could begin, he was deported back to Japan. The story of a Japanese cannibal murdering and consuming a Dutch woman had become big news in France, and the French people did not want to keep a Japanese lunatic on their soil. The Japanese authorities immediately decided that Sagawa should be held responsible for his actions. But because the French courts refused to disclose any documents regarding the case, they could not prosecute Sagawa even though they wanted to. Due to this strange string of events, Sagawa was released into the public during the summer of 1986, causing serious controversy among Japanese people. By this time, Sagawa had considerable notoriety in Japan, and he would capitalize on his fame by showing up on interviews and writing articles or books on his account of the incident. He would gain even more screen time in 1989, when there was a famous serial killing where 4 girls were kidnapped and murdered. Before the culprit was arrested, Sagawa would be invited to TV shows to give his perspective on what the killer's motives were. After the killer was caught, Sagawa would again be invited to share his memories of what it is like to be arrested and interrogated by the police. This publicity obviously had a negative effect on his family. No one would do business with his father, forcing him to retire. His mother became mentally ill due to the infamy she received for being the mother of a monster. Sagawa had destroyed the once happy and wealthy family he had been born into. Regardless of what became of his relatives, Sagawa exploited his newfound fame and positioned himself as some kind of twisted celebrity, being one of the few, if not the only murderer willing to show up on public media. And he wasn't just a murderer, he was a cannibal, something so incomprehensible that it made people interested in what was going through his mind. At the height of his popularity, Sagawa would show up on TV multiple times a week, published multiple books, authored many articles in major newspapers and magazines, and even starred in an adult film. He claims he did all this just to pay the bills, and that he would not do any of it if he had the choice. Contrary to his claims, he would use the money he generated as a celebrity to continue feeding his fetishes. Sagawa traveled the world with young women. He also became close friends with the Japanese adult film actress he co-starred with, and claimed being with her lessened his desire for white women. However, Sagawa's reign as a celebrity would fade over time. By the turn of the century, the Japanese public was no longer interested in him, and his income streams had dried up. To continue funding his activities with women, he would begin stealing money from his family, selling their belongings, and using his father's credit card. This would cause his family to distance themselves from Sagawa even more. In 2005, Sagawa's father passed away, and his mother took her own life the next day. Sagawa was not allowed to participate in his parents' funeral. With no more media appearances or his family to support him, he could no longer sustain himself financially. By the end of 2005, Sagawa would be living in public housing, paying for his daily needs through welfare. In 2010, Sagawa appeared in a Vice interview, where he claimed to still feel cannibalistic urges, although his interest has now shifted to young Japanese women. 3 years later, in 2013, Sagawa suffered from a stroke and was hospitalized, and although he survived, he can no longer walk without support. The same year, he uploaded a short video onto his YouTube channel, describing how difficult it was for him to live his life since the incident, complaining that everyone sees him as a cannibal first, and does not give enough credit to his other accomplishments, such as the books he authored. As of 2022, Sagawa is 72 years old, and is rumored to be still living on welfare, with support from his brother. Many people would feel anger hearing this story, as Sagawa never paid for his crime. Others may feel disgusted at his inhuman actions. Some may even feel pity towards this man for being born with such twisted desires. What do you think of Sagawa Issei? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching until the end. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. I'll see you next time.